All right. So last time we ended talking about the three processes that make the nephron work. And since it was at the tail end of class, I thought we would just sort of go over those again so we don't miss anything. So it all begins with filtration. And the idea behind filtration is you leave things behind and you put things forward. All right. So if we have a filtration membrane, on one side, we've got big things like blood vessels. We've got big things like proteins, right? And then we have a bunch of small things too. We have glucose, sodium, calcium, tiny little things compared to, protein and cells. Well, in filtration, we're going to push on this. So this mixture is blood, right? We're going to push on this, and this membrane here has holes in it, but the holes aren't very big. So all that's going to come through, the cells are going to stay behind because they're too big to fit through the holes. The proteins are going to stay behind, again, too big to fit through the holes. But the small things are going to get pushed through. And then also, water is going to get pushed through because water is very, very small too, right? So this is filtration, and that's what happens. That's this picture. This is what happens at in the renal corpuscle, which is this first part of the nephron that has the glomerulus inside and then the capsule surrounding it. And we're going to talk more about these processes, but this is just an introduction to the three principal processes that we find in the kidney. All right, so filtration is here. This slide is a little funny, so make sure you're looking at the right box with the right thing. Okay, so this is secretion. In secretion, what we're going to do is we're going to put stuff in to the the tubular fluid. Remember, what leaves the glomerulus and enters this space is, we call it tubular fluid until it comes out the end of the collecting system, and then it's urine, right? So in secretion, we're going to pump stuff in. So we're going to push in molecules in like that to get rid of them. So that's secretion. And then the last one is reabsorption. And this is where stuff that's filtered, remember, so like water, for example. Water gets filtered, so it enters the tubular fluid, but water is something we want to hold on to. So in this very first part of the proximal convoluted tubule, we get a lot of this. So water comes out here, but then gets reabsorbed here. So reabsorption is taking back into the blood the substances that are worth salvaging. So things like glucose, things like water, sodium, potassium, those kinds of things that we can use. All right, so those are the three processes. Now, they take place in different, let me back up. So filtration only happens in one place, and that's here in the corpuscle. But secretion and reabsorption happen at multiple sites in the nephron. But different sites do different things. So even though there are only these three processes, where they occur and which molecules are being affected does vary as you go through the nephron. All right, so for example, so here are those three processes: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. So here's filtration, right, at the glomerulus, at the corpuscle. So the corpuscle is the capsule plus the glomerulus inside it. The glomerulus is this tuft of capillaries, and then the capsule is this spherical, shape that's sort of around it. All right, so filtration happens there. Proximal convoluted tubule, here is reabsorption, here is reabsorption. So we're taking things that were filtered and we're moving them out of the urine, out of what will become the urine, so that we can hold on to those things. Then we go down into the nephron loop. We have more reabsorption. So there's one, there's another reabsorption. So this is water, this is salt. We get up to the distal convoluted tubule, and now we get some secretion. So an arrow going in, like we see here and here, that's secretion. the body's putting stuff into the fluid because it wants to get rid of those things. And we'll look at specific examples here in a minute. And then finally, we get into the collecting duct, and we still have reabsorption here, and secretion when necessary here. So the different parts of the nephron have, so filtration only happens in one place, but secretion and reabsorption happen in multiple places along this path. All right. So this table from your book is ugly, but it's also very useful. So you might want to just put a little star next to this table, because the truth is, if you knew everything on this, you have a pretty good understanding of renal physiology. So there's a lot of material on this one table, but it is good stuff. And we're going to go and we're going to talk about these things more as we go on here today. But so this is sort of a summary, which is why I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But the idea here is we have three processes: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. And then we have multiple places in the nephron: corpuscle, proximal convoluted tubule, loop, distal convoluted tubule. So what this slide does is say which of those three processes is happening where along the nephron and what molecules are involved. All right, so for example, filtration is only found in this first box because filtration only happens at the beginning, at the corpuscle. And that's what's described over there. We pull the water out, we leave all the big stuff behind. Then we get to the PCT, and we have reabsorption, and a long list of reabsorption, right? That makes sense, because a lot of what, most of what is filtered out here at the glomerulus is actually stuff we don't want to get rid of. So it makes sense in the very first part of the nephron to do a bunch of reabsorption. So, you have this big long list. Glucose, simple sugars, amino acids, vitamins, ions, like potassium, calcium, magnesium. All of those things are reabsorbed very early on in the nephron because they're valuable. We don't want to lose those things. So like we're going to see that 70% of the water that enters this capsule leaves the nephron right at the beginning, right at the proximal convoluted tubule. All right, so for the PCT, a lot of reabsorption and a small amount of secretion. So we are going to put hydrogen ions in here, as well as toxins we're trying to get rid of. All right, the nephron loop, that's this part. It's all about reabsorption. So sodium and water. That's the nephron loop is all about water and salt. That's all it does. So it reabsorbs sodium on the ascending end, and it reabsorbs water on the descending end. Then we get to the DCT, and we have, again, reabsorption and secretion. Now, the biggest difference between the PCT and the DCT, they do the same things, but the proximal convoluted tubule does the same thing all the time. In other words, it isn't regulated. It's always working. The distal convoluted tubule can change what it does. So if we have excess water on board, the distal convoluted tubule will behave differently than if we have not enough water on board, for example. Or sodium. We have way too much sodium on board. The proximal convoluted tubule is always reabsorbing sodium at the same rate. The distal can change its rate. So it can change what it does to match what the body needs. All right, so the DCT there. In the collecting system, there again, we have reabsorption and secretion, water and salt, as well as for secretion, potassium and hydrogen ions. So that process continues. So a lot of good stuff in this, but remember the three primary processes: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion, and then fit in where those things happen in the nephron, as we'll see as we go through, because we're going to start at the beginning here and go through each piece. All right, so we begin with the renal corpuscle. That is the glomerulus and the capsule around it. So the glomerulus is a ball or a knot of capillaries. And surrounding those capillaries are cells that are called podocytes. So if we look, we can see the tubes here, and then sort of stuck on the walls of these tubes are these cells that have these little feet that kind of wrap around capillaries. So those cells with feet are called podocytes, foot cells, right? And the feet themselves are called pedicels. So podocytes have pedicels. And the pedicels fit together like that. So they sort of overlap almost like fingers. So what that means is we have, so here's a podocyte. These are pedicels, right? And where the pedicels come together, we have, all that's left is this narrow little slit, right, between the two cells. And as we'll see in the next slide, that is part of the filter system. If we're going to have our filter with tiny holes, well, we need some way to make the holes. And the podocytes and pedicels are one of those ways. All right. So that's the inside of the glomerulus. Every glomerulus has two arterioles, an afferent arteriole and an efferent arteriole. So not our favorite words, I know, but afferent is to go in, efferent is to come out, right? So we have an input to the glomerulus and we have an output or an outflow. And these are arterioles, which means they have smooth muscle in their walls, like we see in this picture here. That means they can get bigger and they can get smaller. And that is hugely important, as we'll see later today or next time. That because in order to control how quickly urine is made, the arterioles change size. So for if more urine production is necessary, the in arteriole gets bigger, the out arteriole gets smaller, and we can change things like that. So we have a valve on the afferent, and we have a valve on the efferent arteriole, right? So tuft of capillaries, podocytes, pedicels. Okay. Next. Okay. So the whole point of the glomerulus is filtration. And that filtration occurs because of a couple of important characteristics. All right, so this is a capillary. We've taken a cross-section of this, right? So here's a capillary endothelial cell. Do you see all these little holes in there? Most capillaries are called continuous capillaries, and they don't have holes in them. There are tiny little holes between the cells where the cells come together, but the cells themselves are solid. Well, in the kidney, and just a couple of other places in the body, but for today, the kidney has special capillary cells so that the capillaries are fenestrated. Fenestrated means having lots of holes. So, your colander that you drain the spaghetti with is fenestrated. It's the very same kind of idea. So the capillaries that make up the glomerulus have all these little holes in them, right? We call those pores, like pores in your skin. So because in the end, what we want to do is we want to make a filter, right? We want to keep the proteins and the cells in the blood while allowing everything else into that capsular space. So in order to create that filter, we have to put barriers in place. So the first barrier is this capillary cell. Only small things can go through these holes, right? Then we have let me orient you. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in and we're going to look at the edge of this capillary right here. Okay, so we've zoomed in. This is blood here. This is the wall of the capillary. So this is that endothelial cell, and it has holes in it, right? So here are the holes. The next layer that stuff has to pass through to get from blood to capsule, we call it the dense layer. And essentially, it's a basement membrane. I know we haven't talked a lot about that, but all epithelial cells have a thin sheet that they sit on. And in the glomerulus, that thin sheet we call the dense layer. And just like the pores of the capillaries, the dense layer allows only small molecules through. So it keeps the blood on one side, it keeps the proteins on one side, but it lets tiny stuff like water and glucose and sodium and things like that pass through. And then the last piece is these triangle-shaped things here. Those are the pedicels. So we've zoomed in, and what we're seeing is that we have the pedicels of one cell and the pedicels of another, and they interlock, which means that the gap between them is a little slit, right? So in our picture here, where you see red, that's a filtration slit, like we see here. So these three things together make the filtration membrane. So the filter between blood and what's going to come into this capsular space to start the process of making urine, right? So just like in the respiratory chapter, we talked about the respiratory membrane. Well, here it's the filtration membrane, which is the endothelial cell, the dense layer, and then the filtration slits in between the pedicels of the podocytes. And all of this has one purpose, and that is this over here, to allow small molecules through while preventing the blood cells and the proteins from passing into that space. All right? So why so much attention on this tiny little spot? There's a whole list of kidney diseases that directly result from a breakdown in this filtration membrane. So, for example, there's a disorder where the podocytes shrink and it allows proteins to pass into the urine. The patient starts losing proteins in the urine. Suddenly, they don't have enough protein in their blood, and they start to get very edematous. That's called nephrosis. Another disorder that affects this is glomerulonephritis, is where this membrane breaks down and blood cells are allowed into the urine. So it's not a trivial little spot. There's a whole list of disorders that affect this filtration membrane that keeps the blood cells and protein on one side while allowing the small molecules to pass through into the nephron. All right. And it does make sense because, red cells are big things, hard to make. Proteins are complicated, hard to make things. The body doesn't want to lose anything that's hard to make, right? Because anything that's hard to make, you have to replace, and that takes energy. So all we let through are the tiniest little things. All right. So in order to have filtration be effective, it has to proceed at a reasonable pace, right? We've all filtered water in one form or another. And if you just, like a Brita pitcher, if you just pour the water in, you have to wait a long time for that water to filter through, right? That's not going to work for us in the kidney. We need it to happen faster. So one of the ways you can increase the speed of filtration is to put pressure behind it. So if you hook up a water filter to your sink, it flows much faster. It filters much faster because there's pressure in that water from the tap. Well, in the kidney, the pressure comes from inside the glomerulus because those are capillaries, and capillaries at the other end of the body have a heart attached, right? So the heart is making pressure all the time inside the cardiovascular system. And that pressure is essentially trying to push stuff out of the cardiovascular system all the time. We call that hydrostatic pressure. The heart, just like you have in your sink, when you turn the knob, the water flows very quickly. It's because there's hydrostatic pressure in that pipe. And the heart does that same thing. It creates hydrostatic pressure all the time. So pressure pushing out. That is here in our diagram. What we're going to talk about is how pressure powers this filtration that we're talking about. So GHP, glomerular hydrostatic pressure. Glomerular, because it's inside the glomerulus. Hydrostatic, because that's the kind of pressure it is. It's hydro is water, static is unmoving. So a pressure like in a pipe, no water's moving, but there's still pressure there. And then, pressure, because that's what it is. Okay, so that's an outbound pressure. pressure pushing stuff out into the capsule. So this is the glomerulus, this is the capsule, simplified view here. All right. Not the only player in what's going on here. There is another force working in the opposite direction that we have heard before, but is the more complicated of the pressures to understand, and that's the blood colloid osmotic pressure. We talked about it when we talked about the capillary bed and how things move there. Well, here it's the same thing. So you've got hydrostatic pressure pushing out, but all of this stuff that's dissolved in the blood, so proteins, blood cells, all those things have an osmotic pull. So blood is always pulling on water. And that pulling force we call this colloid osmotic pressure. So we've got 50 pushing out, and we've got 25 pushing in. So now we're down to 25, right? The difference between those two would be 25 pushing out. But there's one more thing we have to consider, and that is the fluid in the capsule also has a pressure. You know, when you go to drain a full sink, it doesn't drain instantly, right? And it's because water can only get out the drain so fast. We have the same thing happening in the capsule. The capsule empties into the proximal convoluted tubule here, but that opening is relatively small. So the fluid can never get out instantaneously. That means it backs up a little, and we have a small amount, 15 millimeters of mercury, of hydrostatic pressure pushing then backwards. So the net of all these things is 10. So if we take 50 minus 25 minus 15, we get 10. So that is net filtration pressure. So what does that mean? All told, given all the forces involved, that's the pressure pushing stuff out of the blood and into the capsular space. So what powers urine formation is this net filtration pressure, right? Because until we get fluid into this capsule, this nephron can't do anything. So the driving force behind urine production in the end is blood pressure. So glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which is offset by colloid osmotic pressure and the capsule pressure, but in the end, we get a filtration pressure pushing out. So the reason we go into all this detail about this is this filtration pressure is what the body is going to modify to control the amount of urine production. You know, a common theme in physiology is the body likes to control everything. It leaves nothing to chance, right? So, like every other organ, the body wants to control what the kidney does. And the way that it does that is by controlling blood pressure inside the glomerulus to control net filtration pressure. Because if we look at our players here, the GHP can change. The colloid osmotic pressure and the capsular hydrostatic pressure can't. They're sort of set. They don't change. So the only way we can turn this up or down is by changing this variable, the hydrostatic pressure. And that's exactly what the body does. Because as we'll see in a minute, because there's a couple of different levels of control that work on this. Okay. There. Okay, that was yesterday. Okay, so glomerular filtration, that's what we were just talking about. That's that picture over there. Water, small solutes entering the capsular space, entering Bowman's capsule. So the most important measure of kidney function is what we call the GFR, the glomerular filtration rate. And what that is it's if you were to look at all of the nephrons in both kidneys, the amount of fluid entering the capsule from the glomerulus per minute, that is the glomerular filtration rate. How quickly the kidneys are creating urine or beginning the process of creating urine. So GFR this is an important definition right here. So it's the rate at which fluid enters all the glomerular capsules of all the nephrons in the body. So it's the primary measure of kidney function. Why? The primary job of the kidney is to get rid of waste products, right? And that occurs in the very first step, in the filtration step. Because all of the waste products that we want to get rid of are small. So small things enter the capsule, and once things are in the capsule, they're gonna stay in the nephron unless they're reabsorbed or they're added to. So wastes come out here and then eventually end up as urine. So as long as the body is filtering at the glomerulus, then it's getting rid of waste products. That's why that bit is the most important. So, for example, you've all heard about dialysis. Dialysis is a way for us to use a giant machine to do what the tiny little efficient kidney does. And typically, we base our decision about whether a patient needs dialysis on their glomerular filtration rate. When the GFR is too low, that's the trigger. That's when we have to put a patient on dialysis, because as the GFR goes down, the waste products in the blood go up because they're not getting rid of them. So we have what's called uremia that develops, where your blood urea, remember urea from our last chapter, it gets higher and higher when your glomerular filtration rate is not adequate. So it is a primary measure of kidney function. So let's look at some numbers. So the normal glomerular filtration rate is about 125 mLs per minute, which 30 mLs is an ounce. So 125, that's about 4 ounces. So that's a significant amount of fluid, and that's per minute. So if we do some math, which we're not going to get into, but the GFR is, we could also say it's 48 gallons per day. So 48 gallons of fluid enter all the capsules of all your nephrons every day. That is a lot. That's a bathtub, right? So clearly, that's about 70 times your plasma volume. So why does that matter? Well, if there was no reabsorption, that glomerular filtration, so what enters the capsule would come out as urine. So essentially, without reabsorption, you would urinate all of your plasma volume in just a matter of minutes or less than an hour. So in this proximal convoluted tubule area, water is pulled back out of this tubule at a very high rate so that we don't, in fact, lose all of that water. All right, so since GFR is what gets rid of the waste products, primary function of the kidney, it is what the body controls about the nephron. So, it also controls some other things, which we'll talk about later, but the principal control of the kidney is the control of glomerular filtration rate, and we control that by controlling the pressure inside the glomerulus. All right. So there are 2 layers of regulation of GFR. The first we call autoregulation, and that's because this is the kidney managing itself. So the brain is not involved, no other organ is involved, so we call it auto. Auto is self, regulation is control, so autoregulation. So one of our homeostasis diagrams, right? So here we are at glomerular filtration rate, normal GFR. So say something happens and the GFR falls. So we have a reduction in glomerular filtration rate. So what occurs in response to that, these are the 2 important changes. Remember, the glomerulus has an in and an out, and there's a valve on each of those, right? So if the GFR falls, that means there isn't enough filtration pressure. There isn't enough pressure inside the glomerulus to push that fluid and solute out. So what happens is the afferent arteriole, the inbound one, dilates, gets bigger, and the efferent arteriole gets smaller. So think about a garden hose. You've got it hooked up to the house, and you've got 2 valves on it, and then you've got a valve at the end and a valve in the middle. And you want to make the sprinkler go higher. Well, one way to make the sprinkler go higher is to open the valve more coming in
and close the valve going out, because that means more water is going to that part of the hose. So essentially that is autoregulation. We dilate the afferent, we constrict the efferent, that causes the pressure in here to go up. That increases filtration pressure, which increases filtration rate, and now we've restored our problem. So the initial problem was too little GFR. Too little GFR means too little GHP, not enough hydrostatic pressure in there. So how do we raise that hydrostatic pressure? Open the valve, close the valve, right? So this is happening nephron by nephron in the kidney all day long, all the time. So it regulates itself around a sort of constant glomerular filtration rate. So, is that all we need? No, because let's say that you've had, our infamous lawnmower accident or chainsaw accident, right? So you've lost a ton of blood, and your blood pressure in your whole body is low. Well, in that case, the glomerular filtration rate will decrease, right? And the body will dilate this and constrict this, but it won't matter because there isn't enough pressure going in the first place. There isn't enough pressure in the body to drive that. So this fails when there is inadequate blood pressure. So when there's not enough blood pressure in the body, autoregulation can't work. So then a second system is triggered that we call central regulation. And obviously with all of the boxes on here, you can see this is the more complicated bit, right? So we have a system that we have heard about before, and we're going to hear about in the next chapter too. So don't think you can escape it. That comes directly right now, and that is the angiotensin aldosterone system. All right, so at the nephron, when GFR goes down because of a decrease in blood pressure, right? So a decrease in blood pressure leads to a decrease in GFR. Anytime the GFR increases, the kidney releases renin. So renin is a hormone, and it has multiple effects. So one of the things that renin does is it triggers the release of angiotensin 1. And yes, if these words sound familiar, we talked about them in the cardiovascular system, right? So renin creates angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 doesn't do anything. Instead, it has to be converted by the ACE enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin 1 becomes angiotensin 2. And then angiotensin 2 does all kinds of things to increase blood pressure. So we're right here in our box and here. So one thing it does is it increases TPR. Remember total peripheral resistance? Some of these things are going to come back to haunt us again for a couple of chapters here. Total peripheral resistance is the arterioles of the body, how big or how small they are. Remember, blood pressure is cardiac output times total peripheral resistance, right? So if we increase total peripheral resistance, we increase blood pressure, right? Because we give the heart more resistance, and that causes the pressure between the heart and the end vessels to go up. So the blood pressure goes up. That's one thing it does. Angiotensin 2 also triggers sodium retention. So, we'll stick with that. So one of the things it does is that. Another is it causes an increase in aldosterone. All right, so directly, angiotensin 2 increases total peripheral resistance. Well, another way to increase blood pressure is to increase cardiac output, right? Remember, this was heart rate times stroke volume, and stroke volume could be changed by changing the plasma volume, how much blood was circulating. Aldosterone works to increase plasma volume, primarily by triggering the reabsorption of sodium at the kidney, which we're going to talk more about that next time at another piece, but that is right here. So angiotensin 2 brings about aldosterone. Aldosterone increases sodium retention. It also, so that helps to reduce fluid losses. And then angiotensin 2 also triggers thirst. And, you know, when you're thirsty, you drink. When you drink, your plasma volume goes up. So we have, that's this path. Stimulates the thirst centers, and it also triggers ADH. And ADH leads to a dramatic decrease in water out, as we'll see later on. So we call this system the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. And it's the primary blood pressure control system in the body. You know, you'd think, you know, that, well, why doesn't the heart control blood pressure? Or why doesn't the brain control blood pressure? In our, in the mammal's physiology, because the kidney needs blood pressure to function, right? No blood pressure means no filtration. And no filtration means no urine formation. So, because the kidney needs blood pressure to work, it's the principal controller of blood pressure. So, anytime your blood pressure goes down, anytime your glomerular filtration rate goes down, and autoregulation can't fix it, you're going to get renin release. Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone. So we all know that high blood pressure is a huge problem in the world today, right? Well, because of that, this system, renin, is the #1 culprit for high blood pressure, at least as we understand it. Because for whatever reason, some people produce more renin than they should, and that triggers this whole other system. So many blood pressure medicines affect this system directly. One, some of you may have heard of, the ACE enzyme, angiotensin converting enzyme. There's a class of medications that inhibits those, the ACE inhibitors, right? So we block that out. That blocks this, which blocks this, and this, and this. So you can see why it's a very powerful blood pressure medicine. Block this ACE enzyme, and the renin system essentially can't function. Yeah?
So, like, if someone has high blood pressure and then they have edema, is that why? Because they have all the extra fluid?
Yes, because their renin system is triggering thirst and fluid retention. Because the kidney wants more blood pressure, and it's trying to get more blood pressure by increasing plasma volume. Yes, that's exactly why.
So when someone's put on the high blood pressure medication, then the renin will
Yes.
constantly be
It
low?
depends on which one they're on, but the fluid retention piece should go down. Yeah. It's another reason why somebody on blood pressure medicines often will restrict their salt intake, because the more salt you have in your body, the more water you'll have in your body. So less salt means less water, less plasma volume means less blood pressure. So it's a non-pharmaceutical way to do it. So a really important system, we're going to talk about it again in the next chapter too, when we look at fluid balance. But for today, its role is to control glomerular filtration. All right, let's see if I missed anything. I didn't talk about all these bits, but we will later. So the angiotensin 2 is really the hot button. You know, renin doesn't do much except activate angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 doesn't do much, but angiotensin 2 does a bunch of things. So once you get to that step, that's the body's going to be trying to increase the blood pressure until that glomerular filtration rate increases. All right. Let's do some questions here. Okay, the filtration barrier in the renal corpuscle consists of which 3 layers? And hold on a minute, I gotta get it set up. Multiple choice. There we go. There, now you should have it. All right. Best answer there, sorry, I have to read them too. This was a hard question to read. The best answer is B. So the endothelium of the glomerulus, which does have pores, has fenestrations in it, right? The dense layer and then the podocyte filtration slits between those two. All right. Each of the following is a normal constituent of urine, except which of those? Now everybody's here. All right. Yep. Best answer A, proteins. Because I erased my filtration diagram there, but proteins and cells are huge. And huge things, big things are blocked by the filtration slits and the pores and all that. So proteins are never supposed to be in the urine. Because they're too big to get through the filtration membrane. These others, urea and creatinine, are waste products, so yeah, we want to get rid of those. Amino acids are things we want to hold on to, but the kidney isn't perfect at getting all the amino acids out of the urine. So we lose some of the amino acids in our diet through the urine. And then hydrogen ions, along with the lungs, the kidney is a principal organ for getting rid of acid. So getting rid of those hydrogen ions is a big part of what the kidney's there for. All right. And one more. The process of filtration is driven by which of those? All right, 3, 2, 1. Very good, you've been paying attention. It's C, blood hydrostatic pressure. So what pushes filtration? And filtration starts the whole process of urine formation. So it's the critical first step. And it's powered by blood pressure, by blood hydrostatic pressure made by the heart, pushing fluid out into this space. And then that fluid goes through the nephron and gets modified, and then eventually comes out as urine when the job's been done, so to speak. All right. We'll talk about, okay, let's do this question, then we'll finish up. Autoregulation of the rate of glomerular filtration has which of the following properties? My timer's not ticking. All right, there we go. So we got a split between D and E, and I don't blame you because we didn't talk a lot about this, but this is a good opportunity to do so. Okay, so we said autoregulation occurs when an individual nephron, when its GFR starts to fall, changes to the afferent and efferent arterial can be made to keep that GFR constant. I didn't tell you why that's important. Blood pressure goes up and down throughout the day, right? You know, if you were to suddenly get up and start jogging or, you know, lay flat on a table, your blood pressure is going to fall, your blood pressure is going to go up. But the kidneys need to maintain a constant glomerular filtration rate, regardless of what the body's blood pressure is. So one of the principal roles of autoregulation is to do just that. So, you know, when you're exercising and your blood pressure is high, you know, the last thing you want is to be making extra urine at that time, right? So what the autoregulation does, because it works in reverse too, if the GFR gets too high because the blood pressure is too high, autoregulation just clamps down on this valve going in and it lowers the pressure. So just like our sprinkler example, if the sprinkler is going way too high, you just walk over and turn down the water flow, right? And that's what autoregulation allows for, is even if pressure is high, the GFR can be kept constant by turning the valves down. So the only time that autoregulation doesn't work is when the blood pressure is too low to make the filtration pressure that's needed. So is B correct? Yes, it is, because autoregulation allows a stable glomerular filtration even as blood pressure goes up and down over the course of the day. All three are correct. The efferent arterial matters, the afferent matters, and then the whole role of autoregulation is to maintain the GFR over a range of blood pressures. All right. We're going to call it a day right there. So